A millionaire bet he could seduce a virgin woman in just 10 days. The virgin seemed like the perfect target, but she was the only one not impressed by his money or charm. What the millionaire didn't expect was that, while trying to win her over, she would unveil the man he'd been hiding his whole life. If this story caught your attention, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Stay tuned. The Manhattan skyline glittered against the midnight sky as Ethan Reed raised his glass in the private lounge of the Summit, the exclusive club where New York's elite gathered to celebrate their invincibility. At 32, Ethan had everything: the penthouse overlooking Central Park, a fleet of luxury cars, and control of Reed Technologies, the company his father had built from scratch and he had transformed into a digital empire. To another successful quarter, said Ethan, his perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit accentuating his athletic frame as he addressed the small circle of associates who called themselves his friends. And to the acquisition that will make us all even richer than we already are. The champagne flowed freely as congratulations echoed around the table. Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying the faces of those who sought his approval: Bradley, Watson, his VP of Marketing, James Cooper, his Chief Financial Officer, and Marcus Fitzgerald, his oldest friend from Exeter, who now managed his personal investments. "You know what your problem is, Ethan," Marcus said, swirling the amber liquid in his tumbler. "You're bored. Everything comes too easily to you." Ethan's mouth curved into a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Is that jealousy I hear, Marcus?" "Observation," Marcus countered. "When was the last time you faced an actual challenge, something you couldn't buy or manipulate your way through?" The table fell silent, the ambient jazz music suddenly more pronounced as the others watched the exchange with interest. Challenges weren't part of Ethan Reed's vocabulary. His life had been a carefully constructed sequence of victories, each one calculated and inevitable. "Name one," Ethan replied, his confidence unwavering. "Name a challenge I can't meet." Marcus's eyes gleamed with mischief as he leaned forward. "A woman you can't seduce. Not with your money, not with your name, not with any of the tricks you've perfected." Bradley laughed. "That's not a challenge, that's a mythical creature." "I'm serious," Marcus continued. "Someone immune to the Ethan Reed charm offensive. Someone who values substance over status." Ethan's interest was piqued despite himself. "You have someone specific in mind?" "As a matter of fact, I do," Marcus said, pulling out his phone. He scrolled for a moment before sliding it across the table. Olivia Bennett. Ethan studied the image on the screen. A woman in her late 20s with chestnut hair falling in soft waves around a face that wasn't conventionally beautiful, but was striking in its intelligence. She wasn't smiling at the camera, but seemed absorbed in a book, unaware she was being photographed. "Who is she?" Ethan asked, his tone deliberately casual. "She runs literary workshops at the Morgan Library. My sister took one last year and couldn't stop talking about her. Apparently she's brilliant, independent, and famously uninterested in dating. Word is she's never been in a serious relationship." James let out a low whistle. "A librarian? That's your great challenge? Ethan could have her number in 5 minutes." "Not this one," Marcus insisted. "She's different. My sister says she once turned down Julian Hargrove. You know, that director who won the Oscar last year. When he asked her out after one of her lectures." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly as he continued to study the photo. There was something about her that intrigued him, a self-containment, a completeness that seemed to say she needed nothing from the world she didn't already possess. "Chutney." "Days," Bradley suddenly announced. "I bet Ethan can't get her to fall for him in 10 days. "Fall for him?" Marcus scoffed. "She'd see through him in seconds. I'm saying he couldn't even get her to agree to dinner." A slow smile spread across Ethan's face. "How much?" "Wait, are we seriously making a bet on this?" James asked, looking uncomfortable for the first time. "Why not?" Bradley replied. 1 million. Each of us puts in a quarter. If Ethan fails, he pays us each $1 million. If he succeeds, we pay him." "Define success," Ethan said, his businessman's mind automatically seeking clear terms. Marcus thought for a moment. "You have to get her to trust you completely, to let you into her life. And since we're talking about a woman who apparently Guards her heart like Fort Knox. You have to get her to admit she has feelings for you. And how will you know if I succeed? Ethan asked. Bradley grinned. We'll know. Trust me. So what do you say, Ethan? Marcus pressed. Are you in, or are you admitting there's something in this world you can't conquer? Ethan looked again at the photo. Olivia Bennet, with her quiet intensity and apparent immunity to men like him. A woman who lived in a world of words rather than wealth. A challenge at last. Something to break the monotony of his predictable success. I'm in, he said, raising his glass. 10 days to win over Olivia Bennet. What Ethan didn't see was the gleam of anticipation in Marcus's eyes, or the way Bradley discreetly tapped something into his phone under the table. He was too focused on the face on the screen, already plotting his approach, already certain of his victory. 3 days later, Ethan found himself in the ornate reading room of the Morgan Library, a space he hadn't visited since a school field trip decades earlier. He'd done his research. Olivia Bennet, 29, had a master's in comparative literature from Columbia. She'd published several well-received articles on modern American literature and had built a reputation for her innovative workshops that combined literature with personal development. No social media presence to speak of, no gossip columns, no visible connections to his world. He'd registered for her 6-week workshop on narrative as identity, how stories shape who we are, under his mother's maiden name, Alexander Wells. The class was small, 12 participants seated in a semicircle as they waited for their instructor. When Olivia entered the room, Ethan was struck by how different she looked in person. Her presence had a quiet gravity that the photograph hadn't captured. She wore a simple blue dress with a cardigan, her hair pulled back in a loose knot, minimal makeup highlighting features that were more harmonious than he'd initially thought. No designer labels, no obvious attempts to impress, yet there was something unmistakably elegant about her. Welcome, everyone, she said, her voice warm and clear. I'm Olivia Bennet, and over the next 6 weeks, we'll be exploring how the stories we read and the stories we tell ourselves shape our understanding of who we are. As she spoke about the power of narrative, Ethan found himself genuinely listening, momentarily forgetting why he was there. She moved with a measured grace as she distributed materials, her eyes lighting up when she discussed passages from books he'd never read. There was passion in her voice, but also restraint, as if she were sharing only a fraction of what she knew. When the workshop broke into smaller discussions, Ethan carefully positioned himself to be in her group. He'd crafted his persona meticulously, Alexander Wells, tech consultant, taking time off to explore his creative side. Interested, but not overly eager. Intelligent, but not showing off. The perfect balance to intrigue someone like Olivia. "And what brings you to this workshop, Mr. Wells?" she asked when it was his turn to introduce himself. "Alexander, please," he said with a smile that had opened countless doors for him. "I've spent most of my career focused on facts and figures. I'm here because I'm starting to wonder if I've been missing the bigger story." It was a line he'd practiced, designed to present himself as a successful man with hidden depths, someone on a journey of self-discovery. The kind of narrative that usually created an instant connection. But Olivia just looked at him, her hazel eyes assessing in a way that made him feel unexpectedly transparent. "That's interesting," she said finally. "Most people come here looking for tools to tell their story better. You seem to be questioning whether you've been telling the right story at all." Ethan felt a momentary disorientation, as if she'd seen through his carefully constructed facade to something he hadn't even acknowledged to himself. Before he could respond, she had moved on to the next participant, leaving him with the unsettling feeling that in their first exchange, Olivia Bennet had read him more accurately than he had read her. As the workshop concluded, Ethan lingered, waiting for the right moment to approach her. Most of the participants had filed out, thanking her as they left. He helped stack chairs, a gesture calculated to appear thoughtful. "You don't strike me as someone who usually stays to stack chairs, Alexander," Olivia commented as she gathered. "Her materials. Is that part of the story you're already telling about me?" he countered with a smile. For the first time he saw a hint of amusement cross her face. "Touché. Though I'd argue we're all constantly reading each other. creating narratives based on limited information. And what narrative would you create about me? He stepped closer, just enough to establish a connection without invading her space. That's not how this works, she said, closing her notebook with finality. The workshop isn't about me analyzing you. It's about giving you tools to understand your own story. Maybe I'd understand it better over coffee? The words came out smoothly, the invitation casual yet clear. Olivia looked at him directly, and Ethan had the distinct feeling she was seeing all the versions of this same scene he'd played out with countless women before. Thank you, but I make it a policy not to socialize with workshop participants, she said, her tone kind but firm. It compromises the learning environment. I'm sure you understand. Before he could respond, she had gathered her belongings and was heading for the door. I look forward to seeing your narrative exploration next week, Alexander. As she disappeared down the corridor, Ethan stood motionless in the empty room. For the first time in years, he'd been denied something he wanted. And for the first time in even longer, he found himself intrigued rather than offended by the rejection. 10 days suddenly seemed like a very short time indeed. The following week found Ethan in his penthouse office, staring absently at the skyline, as his executive assistant Diana ran through his schedule. Quarterly reports needed review. The board wanted a meeting about the new acquisition, and 3 different tech publications were requesting interviews. None of it held his attention. Mr. Reed? Diana's voice broke through his thoughts. Is everything all right? You seem distracted. Ethan turned from the window, composing his features into their usual mask of confident authority. I'm fine. Cancel my dinner with the Singaporean investors tonight. Tell them something came up. Diana raised an eyebrow, but made the note without comment. In 5 years, she'd never known him to cancel a business dinner. What he didn't tell her was that he'd spent the past week thinking about Olivia Bennett more than he cared to admit. He'd had his team compile a more detailed profile on her, discreetly, of course. The information revealed little beyond what he already knew. Distinguished academic record, respected in her field, lived in a modest apartment in Brooklyn. No scandals, no outstanding debts, no obvious weaknesses to exploit. The betting group had already started texting him, needling him about his apparent lack of progress. Marcus had sent a particularly smug message that morning. Day 7. Clocks ticking. Read. That afternoon, Ethan returned to the Morgan Library, but not for the workshop. That wasn't until tomorrow. Instead, he wandered the exhibits, familiarizing himself with Olivia's world. He examined original manuscripts and rare books with genuine curiosity, finding himself drawn to the stories behind the artifacts. When he spotted a small poster advertising an evening lecture on The Evolution of the American Literary Voice by Olivia Bennett, he felt a surge of anticipation. The lecture hall was half full when he slipped in and took a seat near the back. Unlike his workshop where she was facilitating discussion, here she was presenting her expertise, and Ethan was struck by the transformation. Olivia commanded the room with quiet authority, her insights sharp and compelling as she traced the development of American literature from Hawthorne to Morrison. Her passion was evident not in dramatic gestures or raised voice, but in the precision of her arguments and the depth of her knowledge. When the Q&A began, Ethan listened attentively to her responses, thoughtful, often illuminating the question, in ways the asker hadn't considered. He found himself formulating his own question, not as a ploy to get her attention, but because he genuinely wanted to hear her perspective. I'm curious about your thoughts on technology's impact on narrative structure, he said when called upon, careful to use his Alexander Wells identity. Do you see digital media creating fundamentally new forms of storytelling, or just new vessels for ancient patterns? Olivia's eyes found his in the audience, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. An excellent question, she said, and, for the first time, he felt a small thrill at having earned her genuine interest. I'd argue that while the vessels are certainly new, the human need for certain narrative elements remains constant. What's fascinating is how digital formats are reviving some very old storytelling techniques. The serialized novel of the 19th century finds new life in podcast series, for instance. She elaborated further, drawing connections between emerging digital formats and classical narrative structures that Ethan found unexpectedly compelling. When the lecture concluded and the audience began to disperse, he made his way toward the small group gathering around her at the podium. "That was quite insightful," he said when it was his turn. "You've given me a lot to think about before. Tomorrow's workshop. I'm surprised to see you here, Alexander," she replied, gathering her notes. "Most tech consultants don't spend their evenings at literary lectures." "Maybe I'm not most tech consultants," he said with a smile. She studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "No, I'm beginning to think you're not." She glanced at her watch. "I need to return some materials to my office before leaving. If you're interested, I could recommend some further reading on the topic you asked about." "I'd appreciate that," Ethan said, recognizing the opening he'd been waiting for. As they walked through the quiet corridors of the library after hours, Ethan found himself genuinely curious about her. "How did you end up specializing in American literature? Most academics I know seem drawn to European classics." "My grandmother," Olivia said, her voice softening. "She was an English teacher in a small town in Massachusetts. She had this battered copy of Thoreau's Walden that she carried everywhere. After she took ill, I would read it to her for hours." A shadow crossed her face. "She taught me that American literature is about reinvention, about the tension between who we are and who we might become." "She sounds remarkable," Ethan said, surprised by the sincerity in his own voice. "She is," Olivia replied. "She raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 8. She's the strongest person I know, even now with her Alzheimer's progressing." She stopped suddenly, as if realizing she'd shared more than intended. "I'm sorry, that was more personal than you were asking for." "No, please," Ethan said, touching her arm lightly before withdrawing his hand. "I asked because I wanted to know." They reached her office, a small space lined with books and illuminated by a single desk lamp. As she searched her shelves for the titles she wanted to recommend, Ethan noticed photographs on her desk. An elderly woman with Olivia's same intelligent eyes, Olivia in a cap and gown, arm around a younger woman who resembled her. "Your sister?" he asked, nodding toward the graduation photo. "My cousin Emma," she corrected. "We grew up together after I moved in with my grandmother. She's the only family I have left besides Gran." She handed him 2 books. "You might find these interesting." They explore the relationship between technology and narrative structure. Ethan accepted them, noting the worn covers that suggested they were from her personal collection rather than the library's. "Thank you. I'll take good care of them." "I'm sure you will," she said. Then, with slight hesitation, "There's a small cafe just outside the library that stays open late. If you're not in a rush, perhaps we could continue this conversation there." Ethan blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. He'd been planning to suggest exactly that, had been calculating the right moment and approach. Having her initiate it was unexpected. "I'd like that," he said, recovering quickly. The cafe was quiet, just a few patrons lingering over late-night coffees. They found a corner table, and Ethan watched as Olivia ordered a chai tea with the easy familiarity of a regular. "So, Alexander Wells," she said once they were settled, "tell me something true about yourself." The directness of her question caught him off guard. "What makes you think I haven't been telling you the truth?" Her smile was knowing. "Because you're trying too hard to present a specific version of yourself. I teach narrative construction, remember? I recognize a carefully crafted character when I see one." For a moment, Ethan considered sticking to his fabricated background, doubling down on the Alexander Wells persona he'd created. But something about her perceptiveness made him want to offer at least a fragment of truth. "My father built his company from nothing," he said finally. "He expected the same drive from me, even though I was starting from a place of privilege. He never had. I've spent my life trying to prove I deserve what I was given." Olivia's expression softened, and he realized with a start that he'd shared something he rarely acknowledged even to himself. "That's a common American narrative," she said, "the inheritor's burden. The question becomes whether you're trying to prove it to him, To the world, or to yourself? All of the above, Ethan admitted. Though my father's been gone for 5 years now, so I suppose his opinion is no longer a factor. Isn't it? She asked gently. The narratives we form about ourselves in relation to our parents often outlive them. Their conversation flowed with surprising ease after that, touching on literature, philosophy, and the nature of identity. Ethan found himself engaged not just intellectually, but emotionally, sharing thoughts he'd never articulated to anyone in his usual circle. As the cafe began closing around them, Ethan realized with a shock that 3 hours had passed. He'd missed 2 calls from Marcus and ignored a stream of text from Bradley without a second thought. I should let you get home, he said reluctantly as they stepped outside into the cool night air. Thank you for the books and the conversation. Thank you for the thoughtful questions, she replied. It's refreshing to discuss these ideas with someone from outside academia. On impulse, he said, I'd like to see you again. Outside of the workshop setting. Olivia hesitated, and for a moment he thought she would refuse. I meant what I said about not dating workshop participants, she said finally. It doesn't have to be a date, Ethan found himself saying. Just a continuation of this conversation. She studied him for a long moment. There's a poetry reading at the Brooklyn bookstore on Friday evening. If you're genuinely interested in American narrative voices, you might find it illuminating. I'll be there, he promised. As he watched her walk toward the subway entrance, Ethan was struck by a troubling realization. For the first time in hours, he'd remembered the bet, and for the first time since it was made, he felt a twinge of shame about it. Back in his penthouse, he found several missed calls from his betting partners. He ignored them all, instead, opening one of the books Olivia had lent him. As he began to read, a notification popped up on his phone, a message from Bradley with a link to a private Instagram account called The Virgin Conquest, with a caption, Day 7 Update. The Hunter becomes the hunted. Stay tuned. Ethan frowned, clicking on the link. It was a private account, but he'd been pre-approved. What he saw made his blood run cold. Photos of him entering the Morgan Library. A distant shot of him and Olivia talking after the lecture. A blurry image through the cafe window as they conversed. The caption read, Our champion makes contact. Betting pool now open on which approach he'll use to seal the deal. Clock's ticking. There were comments beneath. Crude speculation from usernames he recognized as business associates and social connections. The bet had expanded far beyond their small group, becoming a spectator sport for New York's bored elite. Ethan closed the app, a sick feeling spreading through his chest. What had begun as a frivolous challenge now felt like something much uglier, and sitting in his silent penthouse, surrounded by evidence of everything he had and everything he was, Ethan Reed wondered if he had fatally misjudged not just Olivia Bennett, but himself. The Brooklyn bookstore was nothing like the sleek upscale establishments Ethan frequented. Housed in a converted brownstone, its wooden floors creaked underfoot, and the scent of old paper and coffee permeated the air. Mismatched chairs had been arranged in rows facing a small clearing where a microphone stood, surrounded by potted plants and strands of twinkling lights. Ethan arrived early, dressed in jeans and a simple button-down shirt, a deliberate departure from his usual tailored suits. He'd spent the past 2 days in a state of uncharacteristic indecision. The discovery of the Instagram account had left him deeply unsettled. He'd confronted Bradley, who'd brushed it off as just a bit of fun, and reminded him that he'd agreed to the bet. Marcus had been more direct. Getting cold feet because she's not falling at your feet, that's not like you, Ethan. What neither of them understood was that Ethan's hesitation had nothing to do with the challenge of winning Olivia's trust. It was the growing realization that doing so under false pretenses felt increasingly wrong. He spotted her near the back of the store, arranging chairs with a young woman who bore a strong resemblance to her, Emma, he guessed, the cousin from the photograph. Olivia was wearing a rust-colored dress that complemented her chestnut hair, which fell loose around her shoulders instead of in its usual knot. When she looked up and saw him, her smile was genuine but contained, a small acknowledgement of their shared secret. "Alexander," she said as he approached, I wasn't sure you'd come. I promised I would, he replied, suddenly aware of how few promises he'd made and kept that weren't contractual obligations. She introduced him to Emma, who regarded him with friendly curiosity. "So you're the tech guy who's suddenly interested in American literature," Emma said, her tone light but her gaze assessing. "Olivia mentioned you've been asking some interesting questions in her workshop." "I'm finding there's a lot more to the subject than I realized," Ethan said, meeting her eyes with a directness that seemed to satisfy whatever she was looking for. "Well, you're in for a treat tonight," Emma said. "These poets are redefining what American voices can sound like." She excused herself to help the bookstore owner set up the refreshment table, leaving Ethan and Olivia alone. "Your cousin seems protective of you," Ethan observed. Olivia's smile was affectionate. "Emma and I have been through a lot together. She's seen me at my most vulnerable." A shadow crossed her face, there and gone so quickly Ethan almost missed it. "She worries." "About men like me?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could consider its implications. "About men in general," Olivia corrected gently, "but especially those who seem too polished, too perfect." She met his gaze directly. "I had a relationship several years ago that ended badly. Emma was there for the aftermath." The simple admission hung between them, loaded with unspoken meaning. Before Ethan could respond, the lights dimmed slightly, and the first poet was introduced. As the evening progressed, Ethan found himself drawn into the raw, powerful performances. The poets, diverse in age, race, and background, shared deeply personal experiences transformed into art. A woman in her 60s spoke of losing her home in Hurricane Sandy. A young man explored his conflicted relationship with his immigrant father. A non-binary poet crafted a haunting piece about existing between worlds. Beside him, Olivia listened with complete attention, occasionally making small notes in a tiny notebook she kept in her pocket. During one particularly moving poem about familial forgiveness, Ethan glanced over to see tears gathering in her eyes, though she did not let them fall. He resisted the sudden, unexpected urge to take her hand. After the readings, the space transformed into a reception. As they stood discussing the performances over glasses of wine, Ethan noticed how many people approached Olivia. Students, fellow educators, the poets themselves, all clearly holding her in high regard. "You've built quite a community here," he commented when they had a moment alone. "Words connect people," she said simply. "I just try to create spaces where those connections can form." "Is that why you started your workshops? To build connections?" Her expression grew thoughtful. "Partly, but it was also more personal than that." She took a sip of wine before continuing. "After what happened with Michael, my ex, I retreated into myself. Books had always been my sanctuary, but I realized they could also be a bridge back to the world." "What happened?" Ethan asked carefully, sensing the weight this Michael still carried in her life. Olivia's eyes met his, assessing his intent. "He was charming, successful, persistent. I was flattered by his attention. It took me too long to realize that his interest wasn't in me as a person, but as a project, a challenge." Her voice grew quieter. "When I finally understood that, the way he reacted was frightening. It took a restraining order to get him, to leave me alone." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow, a challenge, a project, the exact terms of his bet with Marcus and the others. Shame coursed through him, hot and uncomfortable. "I'm sorry," he said, the words woefully inadequate. "Farsiga, no one should be treated that way." "It taught me to be careful," she replied, "to trust my instincts about people." Her eyes held his, searching. "My instincts about you are complicated." The moment stretched between them, taut with unspoken questions. Ethan found himself wanting desperately to be worthy of any trust she might place in him, even as he knew his very presence in her life was founded on a lie. The evening wound down, and Ethan offered to help with the cleanup. As they worked alongside Emma and the bookstore staff, he was struck by the easy camaraderie, so different from the competitive undercurrents that defined his usual social interactions. Outside, the Brooklyn street was quiet, stars visible despite the city lights. Emma had already departed, giving Olivia a significant look that Ethan pretended not to notice. "I'll walk you home," he said. Not a question, but not quite a command either. "It's not necessary," Olivia replied, but made no move to leave without him. They walked in comfortable silence for a block before she spoke again. "You never answered my question from the cafe. What are you looking for, Alexander?" The name, his false name, stung now. "Maybe I'm still figuring that out," he said honestly. "Most people who come to my workshops are seeking something specific," she observed. "A way to rewrite their own story or to better understand it, but you—" She studied him in the intermittent light of the street lamps. "You seem to be searching for something you can't name." The insight was so accurate, it left him momentarily speechless. "Maybe I've been telling myself the wrong story for so long, I've forgotten how to recognize the truth," he finally said. They reached her building, a modest pre-war apartment complex with a small courtyard entrance. Standing there, Ethan knew this was the moment where, in his normal playbook, he would make a subtle but clear move, a touch, a look, words carefully chosen to advance the seduction. Instead, he found himself saying, "Thank you for inviting me tonight. It meant more than I expected." "You're an interesting man, Alexander Wells," Olivia said softly, "more complex than you appear." The irony of her using his false name while complimenting his authenticity wasn't lost on him. Before he could respond, she continued, "I'm having brunch with Emma and some friends on Sunday at Maple Street Cafe. If you'd like to join us, we're meeting at 11. The invitation, casual but significant, hung between them. "I'd like that," Ethan said, meaning it more than she could know. "Good night then," she said, a small smile playing at her lips as she turned toward her building. Ethan watched until she was safely inside, then began the walk back to where his driver waited discreetly at the end of the block. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Bradley. "Day 8. The natives are getting restless. Where's our update?" He ignored it, slipping the phone back into his pocket as an uncomfortable thought took root. The bet had specified 10 days. Today was day 8. In 2 days the deadline would arrive, and he would be expected to report his success or failure to the group. The idea of revealing their private conversations, of reducing what was happening between them to a conquest, made him physically ill. For the first time in his adult life, Ethan Reed began considering what it would mean to deliberately lose. Back in his penthouse, he found himself unable to sleep. The city spread out below him, a glittering landscape of possibilities and power that had always been his playground. He pulled out his laptop and, after a moment's hesitation, logged into his personal server. With a few keystrokes, he accessed the back door he'd had his security team build into the company's social media monitoring tool, a system designed to track mentions of Reed technologies across platforms. It took only minutes to confirm his suspicions. The private Instagram account Bradley had created was just the tip of the iceberg. There was a dedicated Slack channel with over 50 members, discussion threads on a private subreddit, even a spreadsheet tracking his progress with betting odds updated daily. What had begun as a stupid, drunken bet had metastasized into a full-blown spectator sport for board members of New York's elite. Worse, he found references to plans to document his eventual victory. The implications turned his stomach. These people, he'd called them friends, colleagues, his social circle, were not just betting on him humiliating Olivia, they were planning to record it for their entertainment. Ethan closed the laptop, his mind racing. He had less than 48 hours to somehow extricate himself from this situation without destroying Olivia's trust or dignity in the process. For a man who had built his life on calculating risks and controlling outcomes, the path forward was alarmingly unclear. As dawn broke over the city, Ethan came to a decision. He would go to brunch tomorrow. He would tell Olivia the truth, all of it, and accept whatever consequences followed. The thought of her anger and disappointment was almost unbearable, but the alternative, continuing the deception, allowing the bet to reach its conclusion on the terms his so-called friends had set, was unconscionable. For the first time in his life, Ethan Reed prepared to deliberately, consciously fail. What he didn't know was that events were already in motion that would make his planned confession too little, too late. Sunday morning arrived with a clarity Ethan hadn't felt in years. He dressed simply. Jeans, a casual button-down, no designer labels. He dismissed his driver and took the subway to Brooklyn, an experience so foreign that he found himself oddly fascinated by the ordinary human drama unfolding around him. The Maple Street Cafe was a sun-drenched corner establishment with large windows and potted plants hanging from exposed wooden beams. Ethan spotted Olivia immediately, seated at a large round table with Emma and 3 others. She wore a green sundress that caught the light as she laughed at something one of her friends said. The sight of her, unguarded, joyful, strengthened his resolve. He would tell her everything, not because it would assuage his guilt, but because she deserved the truth. Olivia noticed him and waved him over, her smile warm, but with a hint of shyness that hadn't been there before. As he approached, he saw Emma's expression shift from openness to wariness, her eyes narrowing slightly as she whispered something to the woman beside her. "Everyone, this is Alexander," Olivia said as he reached the table. "Alexander, these are my friends, Emma, whom you've met, and this is Zoe, my colleague from the library, Nathan, who runs our community reading program, and Vanessa, who was my roommate in college." Ethan shook hands around the table, aware of the evaluating looks, particularly from Emma and Vanessa. These were people who knew Olivia's history, who had probably helped her pick up the pieces after Michael. Their protective caution was palpable. "So tech consultant turned literature student," Nathan said, his tone friendly but probing. "That's quite a pivot." "I've always believed in continuous learning," Ethan replied, settling into the empty chair beside Olivia. "Olivia's workshop has been eye-opening." "Alexander asked some fascinating questions at the poetry reading," Olivia added, a subtle endorsement that seemed to ease some of the tension around the table. Conversation flowed more naturally after that. Nathan was discussing plans for a community literacy program for underprivileged kids in the neighborhood, and Ethan found himself genuinely interested, offering suggestions about potential tech industry partnerships that might provide funding. "You seem to have some serious connections," Zoe observed. "Most tech consultants I know don't have the ear of corporate philanthropy departments." Ethan felt the gentle probe beneath her words. "I've worked with some major companies," he said carefully, conscious of how thin the ice beneath his Alexander Wells persona had become. Vanessa's phone chimed, and she glanced at it, then frowned. She exchanged a look with Emma that sent a chill through Ethan. "Everything okay?" Olivia asked, noticing the silent exchange. "Fine," Vanessa said too quickly. "Just a work thing." The waiter arrived with their food, temporarily diverting attention. As they ate, Ethan found himself drawn into Olivia's world, these intelligent, passionate people who valued knowledge and community over wealth and status. He could see why she felt at home here, among those who saw her completely. It was when the plates were being cleared that Ethan noticed Emma and Vanessa in an intense, whispered conversation, both looking at something on Vanessa's phone. Emma's face had gone pale. "Excuse me," Emma said abruptly, standing up. "Olivia, could I speak with you for a moment?" "Now?" Olivia asked, surprised. "It's important," Emma insisted, her eyes flicking briefly to Ethan before returning to her cousin. As Olivia followed Emma toward the cafe's entrance, Ethan felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. The timing was too coincidental. Something had happened, something connected to the bet, to his real identity. Vanessa was watching him, now her earlier warmth replaced with cold assessment. "You know," she said quietly, "I've always been good with faces." "I'm sorry," Ethan replied, though he knew exactly what was coming. "It took me a while to place you without the designer suit, but I finally remembered. You're Ethan Reed, aren't you, of Reed Technologies?" Her tone was conversational, but her eyes were hard. "Funny how you never mentioned that." Nathan and Zoe looked between them, confusion evident on their faces, but Ethan's attention was fixed on the front of the cafe, where he could see Emma showing something on her phone to Olivia. Even from this distance, he could see the color draining from Olivia's face, her body going absolutely still as she stared at the screen. When she looked up, her eyes met his across the room, and the betrayal he saw there nearly shattered him. "I need to explain," he said, standing up as Olivia and Emma approached the table. But from Olivia's expression, he knew it was already too late. "Explain what exactly?" Olivia's voice was unnervingly calm, though her hands were trembling slightly. "That you're not Alexander Wells, tech consultant, but Ethan Reed, CEO of Reed Technologies. Or that you infiltrated my workshop as part of a bet to see if you could seduce me within 10 days. The bluntness of her words left the table in stunned silence. Ethan felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. "How did you—" "Someone sent this to a former student of mine," Emma cut in, holding up her phone. On the screen was the Instagram account Ethan had discovered, but with screenshots of text messages between him and Marcus discussing the terms of the bet. "She recognized your name and photo from my social media posts about Olivia's workshops. She thought we should know what kind of game you're playing." "It's not what it looks like," Ethan began, knowing how pathetic the words sounded even as he said them. "Really?" Olivia's voice was absolutely controlled, her academics' precision, cutting through his excuses before they could form. "Because it looks like you and your wealthy friends made $1 million bet that you could seduce the virgin librarian in 10 days. It looks like you created a false identity to gain my trust. It looks like dozens of people have been following your progress like some sort of perverted reality show." Her words hung in the air between them, damning in their accuracy. Around them, other patrons had gone quiet, the public confrontation drawing unwanted attention. "I came here today to tell you the truth," Ethan said, desperate for her to believe at least this much. "All of it. I was going to end the bet to—" "What?" Olivia interrupted. "To confess after lying to my face for days, to make yourself feel better about treating me like an experiment." "No," he insisted, "because I care about you, because what started as something inexcusable became real. You became real to me." For a moment something flickered across her face, pain perhaps, or the ghost of what might have been. Then it was gone, replaced by a cold dignity. That was somehow worse than anger would have been. "Please leave," she said quietly. "Whatever game you were playing, it's over now." "Olivia, please." "I think you need to go," Nathan said, standing up. Though not a large man, there was a steadiness to him that made his intention clear. Ethan looked around the table at the protective wall Olivia's friends had formed around her. His gaze returned to her face, searching for any opening, any chance. "To explain. I meant everything I said to you," he said finally, his voice low. "About my father, about feeling lost. That was all true." Maybe it was, she conceded, and for a heartbeat, he thought he might have reached her. Then she continued, "But it doesn't matter, because everything was built on a foundation of lies. You didn't come into my life by chance or choice. You came because I was a target, a challenge, a virgin to conquer." The word hung in the air between them, laden with all the crude implications of the bet. Around them, other cafe patrons were openly staring now, some surreptitiously recording on their phones. "I never saw you that way," Ethan insisted, painfully aware of how hollow his words must sound. "It doesn't matter how you saw me," Olivia replied. "What matters is that you never gave me the chance to see you, the real you. You robbed me of the ability to make an informed choice about letting you into my life." Her words struck him with the force of absolute truth. He had approached her as he approached everything in his life, as something to be controlled, manipulated. The realization left him speechless. "Goodbye, Ethan," she said with finality, turning away from him. As he walked out of the cafe into the bright Brooklyn morning, Ethan felt something fundamental shifting inside him. The carefully constructed world he had built, where wealth and charm could solve any problem, where everything and everyone had a price, was crumbling beneath him. Back in his penthouse, he moved like a man in a trance. He ignored the flurry of messages from Marcus and the others, all demanding updates on the bet's final day. Instead, he found himself staring at the books Olivia had lent him, still sitting on his coffee table where he'd left them. On impulse, he opened one and began, To read, really read, not just skimming for information he could use to impress her. Hours passed as he lost himself in the pages, finding insights about identity and authenticity that seemed to speak directly to the hollow space inside him. The next morning, Ethan did something he hadn't done in years. He cleared his schedule. Then he began to write, not emails or business proposals, but a raw, unfiltered account of who he really was, of all the ways he had failed not just Olivia but himself. He wrote about growing up in his father's shadow, about equating worth with conquest, about the emptiness at the core of the life he'd built. When he was finished, he printed the pages and, without allowing himself to reconsider, called a car to take him to the Morgan Library. He knew she would be there for her Monday workshop, the workshop he now had no right to attend. The security guard recognized him and let him through to the reading room. He found Olivia setting up materials, her back to him as he entered. Even from behind, he could see the tension in her shoulders, the careful precision of her movements that spoke of someone holding themselves together through sheer force of will. "Olivia," he said softly. She turned, and the flash of vulnerability in her eyes before they hardened told him everything about the pain he had caused. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice even. "I know." He held out the pages he'd written. "I just wanted to give you this. It's not an excuse or a justification. It's just the truth. Finally." She made no move to take the papers. "I've had enough of your versions of the truth." "This isn't for forgiveness," he said, placing the pages on the table between them. "I know I don't deserve that. This is because you deserve honesty, even if it comes too late." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the weight of what might have been, hanging between them. "Did you win your bet?" she asked finally, the question hitting him like a physical blow. "I withdrew from it," he said, "and I exposed the whole thing to everyone involved. The Instagram account is gone, the messages deleted. I can't undo the humiliation, but I've done everything I can to prevent it from spreading further." She nodded once, acknowledgement but not forgiveness. "I need to prepare for my workshop." "Of course." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "For what?" "It's worth you were right about me. I was telling myself the wrong story for so long I couldn't recognize the truth. Meeting you, I started to see myself clearly for the first time." "I'm glad for you," she said, and he could hear that despite everything she meant it. "But my role in your journey of self-discovery is over." As he walked out of the library into the busy New York street, Ethan felt both a crushing weight and a strange, unexpected lightness. He had lost something precious before he'd even fully understood its value, but in that loss he had found a truth about himself he could no longer ignore. In his pocket, his phone buzzed incessantly with messages from Marcus and the others, demanding to know if he'd won the bet, threatening to make the footage they'd gathered public if he didn't respond. With a decisive motion, he powered off the device and dropped it into a trash can on the corner. For the first time in his adult life, Ethan Reed walked away from a game he had no desire to win. 6 months passed, a time of profound transformation for Ethan Reed. The day after his final confrontation with Olivia, he had called an emergency board meeting at Reed Technologies. By the end of that week, he had stepped down as CEO, appointing Diana, his former executive assistant whose strategic brilliance he had long overlooked, as his successor. He remained on the board, but divested himself of day-to-day operations. His exit from New York's social scene was equally abrupt. He sold his penthouse, cut ties with Marcus Bradley and their entire circle, and purchased a modest brownstone in a quiet corner of Greenwich Village. The tabloids had a field day with speculation about his sudden lifestyle change, but for once in his life, Ethan didn't care about public perception. On a crisp autumn morning, Ethan sat in a small community center in the Bronx, surrounded by a dozen eager faces ranging from 8 to 18 years old. This was the Horizon Literacy Project, a program he had founded with the money he would have lost in the bet, $1 million, seed funding for reading programs in underserved communities across the city. "Who can tell me what Langston Hughes meant when he wrote 'I too am America'?" he asked the group, his demeanor quiet but engaged in a way the old Ethan Reed would never have been. A shy 12-year-old named Miguel raised his hand. It means that even if people try to say you don't belong, you do. You're part of the story too. Exactly, Ethan smiled, genuinely moved by the boy's insight. Every one of us is part of America's story. That's why it's so important that we all have the tools to tell our own stories. After the session, as the kids were packing up their books and notebooks, all provided by the program, Nathan approached from where he'd been observing at the back of the room. "You've got a real gift with them," he said, his initial distrust having mellowed into cautious respect over the months they'd worked together on the project. "They make it easy," Ethan replied. "They're just looking for someone to take them seriously." Nathan nodded, then hesitated, before continuing. "The Morgan Library called. They're interested in partnering with us for the Summer Reading Initiative. Their education director thinks our program would align well with their community outreach goals." Ethan went still. He hadn't set foot in the Morgan Library since that final confrontation with Olivia. "That's great news," he said carefully. "You should definitely pursue it." "There's more," Nathan said, watching him closely. "They want to send someone to observe our methods firsthand. They're sending Olivia." The name hit Ethan like a physical force, despite the months of careful compartmentalization. "I see," he managed. "When?" "Next Tuesday," Nathan replied. "So I can handle it if you'd prefer to be elsewhere." Ethan considered the offer, tempted by the easy escape. But something in him, the new self he'd been slowly, painfully constructing from the ruins of his old life, rebelled against the cowardice. "No," he said finally. "This program is too important to let personal history interfere. Just let her know in advance that I'll be there. I don't want her to be blindsided." The following Tuesday arrived with an unseasonable warmth that had the kids restless and chattering as they filed into the community center. Ethan was reviewing his notes when he felt a shift in the room's energy. Looking up, he saw her standing in the doorway. Olivia looked different. Her hair was shorter, falling just below her shoulders, and there was a new confidence in her posture. But her eyes were the same, that mixture of intelligence and compassion that had first drawn him to her beyond the superficial terms of the bet. Their eyes met across the room, and Ethan nodded once in acknowledgement before turning his attention back to the children. He wouldn't approach her. The choice to engage or not would be entirely hers. The session went well despite his awareness of her presence at the back of the room. The kids were discussing the giver, debating the value of emotional pain versus the comfort of ignorance. Ethan guided rather than led, asking questions that pushed them to articulate their thoughts more clearly. "But if you never feel sad, how do you know when you're really happy?" argued Desiree, a precocious 10-year-old. "That's deep, Des," her older brother Marcus countered. "But wouldn't some people choose to never feel anything bad if they could? Then they'd be choosing not to be fully human," Ethan suggested gently. "Our capacity to feel pain is connected to our capacity for joy, for empathy, for change. Without it, we might never recognize when we need to grow." He felt Olivia's gaze on him at these words, but didn't look her way. This wasn't performance for her benefit. This was who he was becoming, slowly and with many setbacks but authentically. After the session, as the kids filed out with their usual high fives and fist bumps, Ethan busied himself organizing materials, giving Olivia space to leave without awkwardness if that was her choice. When he finally looked up, she was still there, approaching his table with measured steps. "That was impressive," she said, her voice bringing back a flood of memories. "You've built something meaningful here." "Thank you," he replied simply, "but it's not just me. Nathan has been instrumental, and the kids themselves bring so much to it." An awkward silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken history. "Nathan tells me you stepped down from Reed Technologies," she said finally. "I did. Diana Chen is CEO now. She's brilliant, far better suited to the role than I ever was." "And this is what you do now, literacy programs?" "Among other things," he said. "I've been writing, actually. Nothing publishable, just trying to make sense of things." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Still working on your narrative?" The reference to her workshop, to the time when he'd been lying about who he was, could have been accusatory. But there was something else in her tone, a genuine curiosity perhaps. Every day, he admitted, it's a perpetual draft, full of revisions. Another silence, but less strained this time. I read it, you know, she said suddenly. What you left for me that day. I didn't want to, but you can't resist an unfinished story, he finished. For her, remembering how she'd described herself in one of their conversations. She nodded, then gestured to the now empty classroom. The library is very interested in your program. I'll be recommending a formal partnership. Thank you, that would mean a lot to the kids. As she turned to leave, Ethan found himself speaking without planning to. Olivia, she paused, looking back at him. I never apologized properly, not really. I was too busy trying to explain, to justify, but there's no justification for what I did, and I am truly sorry. She studied him for a long moment. I believe you, she said finally, and I appreciate hearing it. She hesitated, then added, Your grandmother, is she still? She passed away last month, Olivia said, a flash of raw grief crossing her face, peacefully, in her sleep. I'm sorry, he said, meaning it deeply. She sounded like an extraordinary woman. She was. A soft smile touched Olivia's lips. She would have liked what you're doing here. She always believed books could save people. With a final nod, she left, leaving Ethan with the strange sensation of an ending that might also be a beginning. 3 weeks later, the Morgan Library formally announced its partnership with the Horizon Literacy Project. Ethan found himself in the ornate reading room once again, surrounded by library officials, community leaders, and program participants. Olivia was there in her professional capacity, polite but distant as they exchanged pleasantries for the benefit of colleagues. As the event wound down, Ethan found himself alone in a quiet corner of the library, examining a display of rare first editions. The familiar feeling of being watched made him turn to find Olivia approaching. I've been meaning to return something to you, she said, reaching into her bag and withdrawing a slim volume. It took him a moment to recognize it as one of the books she had lent him all those months ago, the night they'd talked at the cafe. You kept it all this time? He asked, surprised as he accepted it. I found it recently while going through some things of Gran's, she explained. It must have gotten mixed in with her books during the move to hospice. Ethan opened the cover, finding a note he had written on a slip of paper tucked inside. Thoughts on a passage he had intended to discuss with her before everything fell apart. I'm surprised you're willing to speak to me at all, he said honestly, looking up from the book to meet her eyes. I wasn't, for a long time, she admitted. What you did was a profound violation of trust. I know, he said simply, not offering excuses. But, she continued after a moment, people can change, their stories can change. Isn't that what literature teaches us? That transformation is possible? Is that forgiveness? He asked carefully. No, she said firmly. Not yet. Maybe not ever completely. But it is. An acknowledgement that the man who started the Horizon Project isn't the same man who made that bet. Ethan nodded, accepting both the limitation and the small opening it represented. There's a lecture series on American literary voices starting next month, she said. Open to the public, if you're interested. It wasn't an invitation exactly, but it wasn't a dismissal either. It was, Ethan realized, something far more valuable. It was a choice being returned to her hands, the autonomy to decide what role, if any, he might have in her life going forward. I'd like that, he said simply. As they parted ways at the library entrance, no promises were made, no declarations offered. There was only the quiet recognition of two people who had hurt and been hurt, who had changed and were still changing, who were writing and rewriting their own stories, one page at a time. 6 months later, Ethan sat in a small independent bookstore in Brooklyn, a well-thumbed copy of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass open on his lap. Around him, a group of readers, some from the Literacy Project, some from the community, some who had found their way there by chance, discussed the meaning of the poet's words. Across the circle, Olivia led the discussion with the same passion and insight that had first caught his attention, now free from the shadows of deception that had clouded their beginning. Their eyes met briefly across the room, and the small smile they exchanged held neither the heat of romance nor the coldness of estrangement, but something else entirely: mutual respect, cautious friendship, and the shared understanding that the most powerful stories are not those we use to conquer others, but those that teach us to conquer ourselves. In that moment, surrounded by words that had endured centuries and people finding their own voices, Ethan Reed understood that true wealth had nothing to do with the millions in his bank account. It lay in the authenticity he was slowly reclaiming, in the communities he was helping to build, and in the possibility, however distant, that someday he might be worthy of not just Olivia's forgiveness, but her trust. As the evening drew to a close and the group dispersed, Olivia approached him, a manuscript in hand. "I finished reading it," she said, returning the pages he had given her weeks earlier. His first attempt at creative writing, a story about a man learning to see himself clearly for the first time. "That bad, huh?" he asked with a self-deprecating smile. "Actually, it has potential," she replied. "The narrator is frustratingly obtuse at times, but by the end, I found myself caring what happened to him." "High praise indeed," he said, their eyes meeting in shared understanding. "Not praise," she corrected gently, "just truth." As they walked together toward the subway, neither leading nor following, just walking side by side, Ethan realized that in losing the bet that had brought him into Olivia's life, he had gained something far more valuable: the chance to become someone worthy of staying there. The story that had begun with arrogance and deception hadn't ended with romantic triumph or tragic separation, but with something far more real: two people, flawed and complex, learning to navigate a relationship built not on conquest, but on the hardest, most rewarding work of all, becoming better versions of themselves, one page, one day, one choice, at a time. And in a world obsessed with fairy tale endings and instant gratification, perhaps that was the most honest love story of all. Fim de Historia. Dear listeners, we hope that Ethan and Olivia's journey has resonated with you. Their story reminds us that real transformation is possible, but only when we're brave enough to face our deepest flaws. For more emotionally rich narratives that explore the complexity of human connection, we've created a special playlist. Just click the link to your left. If this story touched you, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day we bring you unique stories that delve into life's most profound challenges and transformations. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What moment in Ethan and Olivia's journey spoke to you most? Join our community of storytellers and story lovers as we continue to explore the beautiful complexity of the human heart.